Okay, just to kind of wrap up our discussion of Asian American professionals, and we left off last time with the discussion of the glass ceiling, and this again, this unwritten obstacles that are faced by many Asian Americans in even their professional lives. And this is actually reflected in some of the statistics. For example, it was found that Asians in Silicon Valley, and this is in the year 2017, they held 47% of the professional jobs in Silicon Valley, and that was compared to 43% of whites. Yet, when it came to the top tier positions, we're talking about the executives in Silicon Valley, when it came to the comparison between whites and Asians at that level, the very top, well, it was found that whites held 70% of the executive positions compared to Asians at 25%. Again, that's the very top executive level. So even though Asians are well represented in Silicon Valley, well, they're confined to mostly the lower tier. Okay, so again, they're likely to occupy lower tier management positions, technical positions. And when interviewed about this, many feel that there have been some, to use a word, Orientalist stereotypes that they feel they're subject to. And what does this mean? You know, this notion of Orientals lacking assertion, not being very assertive in the job, too passive, too technical, and less creative, right? And also lacking in leadership skills. So these, again, are sort of characteristics that you could attach to that passive, docile Oriental, right? And certainly, even at the highest level of their professional lives, it seems to pursue them there. Okay, so now we're moving from the professional class towards that of laborers, Asian American laborers. And remember, this is the third level of work that we're looking at in this lecture. So when we think of laborers, we think of the working class, widely defined, widely construed. And these are the common jobs for many newly arrived Asian immigrants. Many of these jobs are semi skilled, if not unskilled. They require little education, little training. Many of them are low pay. And in fact, many of them are found in the secondary positions, right? There are secondary jobs in even the segmented labor market. Okay, here's those terms we introduced earlier, and here's where we could apply them. So, what are we talking about? What kind of jobs here? We're talking about, let's say, a taxi driver, gas station attendants, caregivers, nannies, maids, assembly line workers, custodians and janitors, store clerks. There's various positions in the service economy. For example, like a good example actually is a nail salon comprised of Vietnamese women workers, typically, right? Or think of an ethnic restaurant. Think of a Indian food restaurant where many of the staff there, the waiters, the cooks are, co-ethnics, right? Many of them immigrants. So these are the common jobs that we could classify as laborers as opposed to professionals. Now, here's the thing about the laborers when we talk about Asian American immigration as it relates to the model minority image. And it's this very fact that these segments, the laborers, the working class, are hidden from the model minority stereotype, right? They're rendered invisible. Why is it that when we invoke the model minority in mainstream discourse, in the mainstream media, we're only talking about professionals, as well as, let's say, when we discuss education, right? We talk about only, the college educated or the, doctors and lawyers. Well, there are many Asian American immigrants, and you probably know this from observation in your everyday life, that occupy these positions I just referred to in the job market. right? Many of them, again, are in the secondary labor markets. So, and by the way, during the pandemic, it became exposed here to the general public in the news. Well, they showed, professional Asian Americans like nurses and doctors, but they also showed many Asians as so-called essential workers in the lower tier jobs of, the labor market. People like, restaurant workers or Walmart workers, right? People work at grocery stores. These are the businesses that had to stay open by necessity, okay, because they couldn't close despite the pandemic. So they're putting themselves in harm's way, so to speak, more so than the average person who was isolated. Okay, so these essential workers were Asians. Okay, many of them were, and overall they were minorities, and therefore you saw a higher, mortality rate with this group. Okay, so this brings up to a distinction here between social capital and human capital, as noted in the slide here. So what is the distinction here? Social capital refers to resources based on the immigrants' social ties and connections that he or she finds once they arrive here in the United States. And usually, and this is probably obvious to us, they're co-ethnics, right? You come here as a, let's say, Vietnamese immigrant, you find yourself more than likely in a Vietnamese community, and you could, try to find these connections based on co-ethnicity. Okay, so again, social capital refers to those resources based on the migrants' social ties, social networks, social connection. And the key word there is social, right? You're thinking about all the different connections that that person has beyond the individual itself, right? Hence the term social. So what's an example of that? Immigrants, let's say, getting a job through a family or a friend, right? Someone vouching for a newly arrived friend to get them a job, right? Ethnic organizations that help them in settlement and finding a job, or maybe a newly arrived entrepreneur that wants to open a business and they use their business contacts, right? These are all what social scientists refer to as social capital. Okay, now when it comes to human capital, here you're thinking more of the individual here. So in the context of immigration, and specifically immigration from Asia, you're talking about the Asian immigrants' individual skills, education, knowledge, experiences, and these valuable assets that you have is known as human capital. Okay. Now, when it comes to professionals and laborers, they both rely on both types of capital, social and human. However, it is true, and this is important to note here, that when it came to Asian American laborers, the laboring class or the working class, they rely on social capital a lot more than human capital. Okay, and that's kind of obvious when you think about it because, let's say, if you're a professional, you have experience, you have certification, education. Well, you could perhaps, and even the language skills, right? You could perhaps rely less upon trying to reach out to co-ethnic contacts, right? Trying to get a job. You could go straight to the source. Let's say you're a nurse, you could straight to a nursing agency that hires you, right? Now, when you think of a laborer, on the other hand, well, they by necessity have to reach out and make use of social capital. For example, informal introductions. Like I said earlier, you vouch for your new friend or your sibling that just arrived to get them a job, right? You vouch to other people you may know, right, to hire them. So because of this, because many laborers rely on social capital more so than human capital, it becomes the case that many migrants end up in the same economic niches as other co-ethnics. And again, perfect example here is the Vietnamese immigrants and the nail salons, right? Especially women. Or in the case of Filipinos, many of the immigrants, a typical job they could rely on to get is something like caregiving. So you'll see a lot of Filipina, especially women again, working as caregivers for the elderly. Okay, so again, social capital is useful here. It's actually necessary for most of the laborers. Now, some of these laborers may have college degrees, even advanced degrees, and indeed experience. In other words, they do have some human capital. But oftentimes, when they arrive here, they are underemployed as laborers. Okay, in other words, it's often the case that their human capital, for example, a college degree, is invalid when they come to the United States. Okay, so they're forced to get another job, and often they become underemployed as laborers rather than professionals. And moreover, as noted in the slide, there tends to be this gendered segregation of laborers. What happens here is the transferring of gender roles of their home country, following them to their host country when it comes to work. Okay, for example, Asian men tend to work as waiters, as in construction, as taxi drivers, more so than Asian women. The women, on the other hand, tend to work as domestic workers, caregivers, as I just mentioned, factory workers in the garment industry. And what this does is reproduce the patriarchal traditions, that is to say, male-dominated traditions from their old country into the new country. Okay. Now, here's an interesting dimension to the gendered segregation. Is today, the middle-class American women, and here I'm talking about not the immigrants, but, your typical American middle-class women, because of the least recent strides made in, women in the world of work today, right, the everyday middle-class American, you see them achieving more equality and parity in the workplace. They could leave behind domestic duties that they were once relegated to, right, in the 1950s and before that. They could become part of the world of work. But what happens to those domestic duties that they once assumed when they were stuck in the house, these middle-class women? Well, the cleaning, the child care, this is all done now at the expense of immigrant women like nannies and maids, right, and Filipino caregivers, for example. They're doing the household work. They're doing all the stuff that was once relegated to the middle-class American wife. Okay, so interesting change here. Basically, it's still gendered work, but now you have the immigrant other doing the work rather than the American women.